Yeah, you can start the recording. Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the online Feminist Spatial Practice Community Program. My name is Renske Maria van Dam, and today I will be hosting the practice share concerning Feminist Spatial Crafts. We have initiated this online practice share as a way to celebrate feminist spatial practices and connect with like-minded practitioners across the globe. In this session, Virginia Melnik and Sarah Kodorin are invited to present their practice. Today we start with a presentation by Virginia. She will present her work from the airport. But we are very happy to have her here. She is currently pursuing a PhD in the Digital Futures International PhD program at Tongji University. With a focus in textiles and crafts, she specializes in material design and deployable structures. Her presentation will be followed by techno-optimist and robot lover Sarah, who is currently an assistant professor of architecture at Lawrence Technological University. Her research interests span large-scale additive manufacturing, robotic fabrication, generative AI for world building, and digital crafts. And at the moment, she is in Arizona, but she is based in Detroit. Elaborating on the work of Virginia and Sarah, we will explore crafts or craftsmanship in a feminist context by critically questioning assumed gender norms, as well as by addressing the empowering potential of craft work as a form of research, resistance, and care. I will invite Virginia now to share her screen so we can start the presentations.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. So I
Yes.
wanted to take this opportunity to speak about craft, but also practice and how craft and making can be somewhat of an intimate practice, something that is very personal and really is related to the maker and the creator, as well as the practice of doing and learning through doing. So my relationship with textiles starts at a really early age. So when I was about 8 years old, I started taking weaving classes at the local art gallery, and I took these classes for many, many years. I really loved working with yarn, the fact that you could take a singular string, which is kind of nothing, and turn it into a full piece of fabric. And that weaving eventually translated into knitting. When I started doing my PhD research, my advisor kind of encouraged that knitting was maybe more in the direction of the future. There are several architects that are researching knitting and really looking at these technological aspects of knitting and how it can be programmed and manufactured with digital knitting machines. Knitting machines were originally a major part of the Industrial Revolution, taking this kind of craft that was all done by hand and translating it to the machine was quite tricky, where looms and weaving machines were much easier for that translation. Knitting machines, because of the way that they're made with needles rather than a warp and a weft, is much harder translation. So the first knitting machines were really invented in 1589 by William Lee. And as a small anecdote, he was British, but he applied for a patent and the Queen said no because she thought it would unemploy all of the knitters in the country. And so this fear of technology was kind of part of that process in the knitting machine. And so he went to France, and the French king was like, yes, let's get technology. So we're seeing already that kind of rejection of technology with these inventions that we see today. But of course, knitting moved from industry back into a home craft, and even the knitting machine eventually became a popular home craft. And you can see the kind of imagery, those earlier images showing the men in the knitting factory toiling away, making stockings, to now these kind of advertisements for knitting machines that are all advertising towards women and towards the domestic user, someone who can knit at home and knit sweaters for their family. And so this is the type of machine that I actually use in my practice. So although I started knitting, thinking about these big fancy digital knitting machines, I've actually gone back to using one of these older machines. And so in my practice, what I'm really interested in is this kind of material quality, the tactility, the feeling, and the way it stretches and the way it looks when it stretches. So I like to intermix materials, or in this case, an elastic yarn in white and an acrylic yarn in gray. And when it's stretched in one direction, the white yarn is exposed. When it's stretched in the other direction, the white yarn is hidden. And so this kind of reaction and wrinkling that happens as the two different yarns interact. I also am playing with structures that transform, because this idea of transformation, shifting, and changing is really important to me. This flexibility, that things should be soft and temporal, is something that I'm playing with. And so this project that I started to develop around these scissor structures for an exhibition in Richmond, Virginia, started with these kind of basic grid structures and just making them small and getting them bigger. And I'm really sorry about my messy hair in that video. It's like a Saturday afternoon. I didn't shower because I was so excited. But then how do I put the fabric on it? Because the sticks are one thing, like anyone can make sticks, but making a knit fabric that's specific to that shape change and to that patterning was really what I wanted to challenge and look at, that material and that texture. And so here I'm going to talk about that process and how that process is nonlinear, it's messy, it's a little bit chaotic, and I'm learning through doing. So I got all this yarn really from some random guy on Facebook Marketplace who got it from a sock factory in North Carolina. And I went to his backyard, probably was almost kidnapped, but I didn't get kidnapped. I just got a lot of yarn in beautiful colors that I could play with. So one of the main yarns that I'm working with here is this elastic sock yarn that stretches a lot. And I showed that elastic yarn earlier. And then these kind of nylon yarns, which don't stretch nearly as much, but still have a little bit of transparency when they are opened up. And then combining those two together, you can see that difference between the small white stripe and then when stretched and pulled, larger white stripe. I work through a lot of samples and a lot of testing, and this is all done by hand. It's all kind of just through making, looking, measuring, feeling how that stretches, feeling the amount of pressure and force that it can take, and playing with that. I did create patterns digitally to knit the pieces that I was proposing, but ultimately when I'm working, it goes back to a little sheet of paper with a series of numbers and a color code of when to switch those colors of yarn. Because ultimately, while I'm sitting there working at the machine as a person, because I'm still working on this manual machine, I can't really read these color patterns. I'm not a robot, so I'm looking at numbers and being able to count the rows and be like, oh, now I have to switch to the yellow yarn or the red yarn or the white yarn. The first samples were a mess. So working with these machines, there's so much sensitivity between the tension of the yarn, how quickly you move the carriage back and forth to bring the yarn through, and all these little things. And I was actually putting the yarn feeder in wrong sometimes and losing stitches. So I was getting quite a mess to deal with. And you can see that detail here of like a stitch that got dropped and some of the irregularity in these stitches that just change based on minor adjustments in pressure and speed and tension of the yarn. So the knitting is never perfect. It's always a little bit messy or a little bit different and irregular. So when we look at the machine that I have in detail, basically it's several of these little hooks, and the yarn is coming through this little feeder tube and going down, and these hooks are catching it as it goes down. You can't really see because there's a brush in the way to make sure there's no lint and other dust, but all these little hooks are slowly picking up that yarn. And sometimes it's missing them and having issues, and you can see here from the top view what's happening at a larger scale. So the pattern I was working on has 3 stitches in the front, 3 stitches in the back. So that's why you see this kind of green line zigzagging back and forth as the yarn goes back and forth and gets picked up by each of those little hooks. So it's very tactile and manual experience. So when you watch me doing this, my whole body gets involved in that moving of the yarn back and forth. And there's this kind of clicking sound, which I didn't record. I wish I had, but I also listened to the TV while doing this. So it's just like click, 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 as I'm moving back and forth, and these needles are picking up all the stitches. And it becomes part of that process of just working and connecting with the material that you're making. And of course, I have to change the color of the yarn every once in a while. So when I get to the end, I take that feeder out, replace it with a different one, and then keep continuing my process of knitting and going back and forth. And then when I need to change the color again, I bring it back all the way to the end and switch it out again. So here, another color is replaced. I'm also sometimes changing the stitch lengths. So you see those little knobs also change other features in the design. So there's very manual steps to all of this process of changing the yarn, moving the machine back and forth and working with it. So even though it's a machine, it's not the same kind of digital machine where you just press a button and send the file and watch it go. I'm really working through it all. And the final step is the most tedious, which is the casting off step, where every stitch and every loop on each of these hooks has to be sewn in. So each one gets looped over to the next and connected. And you can see how tedious this could be. And this is sped up like 10 times because I don't move that fast. But you can see how it's very tedious, each stitch being connected and tied off. So through that process, ultimately, I ended up with several panels of fabric that I could attach to these like scissor structures and work with that kind of bending and stretching and changing of shape. And I think of this a lot within the way that we want our environments to change and adjust. This is the second piece that I created. So that one was, the previous one was paneling on diagonals. This one's paneling in a different way. And you can see also with the texture here, these kind of vertical striations versus the horizontal color striations. And I'm actually using a rib knit stitch, which is like you would find on your socks. So I'm using sock yarn. I'm using the same stitches that you would find on socks. So it's something that's very familiar, but then translated into a somewhat unfamiliar place and location. And so here's the movement of that piece. These were layered together with a second layer. So two scissor structure frames that were attached with about 6 inches apart from each other to create depth and more dynamicism. And so here's me attaching that second layer, just using bolts, and then I'm trimming some of the little ends of string. So these pieces were displayed or are currently on display at an architecture firm in Richmond, Virginia. So if anyone is in Richmond, Virginia, or planning to go in the next week or so, it's still up for the month of February. And you can see how this piece with the red in front, you can see the green behind it and that kind of slightly transparent effect through the knit and through that kind of lightness of the material. And then the same with this one, which is blue and has the red layer behind it, creating a different grid. So these pieces were super laborious and took a lot of time. So I had more wall space to fill. So I also developed some other projects to exhibit as well. Here's more of those, the detailed video. Hopefully I'm not making you motion sickness with my bad filming, but yeah. So the second project that I developed, I wanted to play with not just a regular scissor grid, but play with a different shapes and geometries. So quickly looking at that, I did a circle, a line, and a squiggle. And these pieces, I used the white yarn. So I had to dye it with Kool-Aid, which is a little DIY trick that Kool-Aid dyes everything so much. So this is just cherry flavored Kool-Aid. And you can see here me just dip that white already knit piece into a pot of, I think this was limeade, Kool-Aid, and just dipping it in that boiling pot. And the colors just come out so surprisingly vibrant. So there's the limeade attached to the frame. And here it is moving and transitioning. Here's a blue raspberry and that cherry. I think this was actually cherry and strawberry kiwi mixed together. And that is the final series of pieces where I was really working with the material, as you can see, working with these different processes, working with different ways of making, and really getting intimate with these pieces. So all of them are about transformation and change, but they're also about that process of making and the time and the labor and the energy and the patience to get to this point and the tactility that they result in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for your beautiful presentation. I see already people making hearts and good smileys. We will immediately move on to Sarah's presentation, and then afterwards we have a collective conversation. If you already, for the audience, if you already have a question, you can write it down or even put it in the chat, so we will pick up on it later. Sarah, I will invite you to share your screen.
Give me just 1 second. I was trying to
Take
share
your time. Yeah.
Can you see everything right?
Yeah, I see everything right, and we can hear you.
Perfect. Sounds great, and was delightful to hear about Virginia's work. So I look forward to the conversation. So thanks again for having me here today. I want to talk about a few of my interests. I work with robots, and I also want to share a little bit of the context where I carry out my research, my practice, also my teaching, as I'm an assistant professor of architecture at Lawrence Technological University. It's located in Metro Detroit and has really a close relationship to the industry. I started being interested in connecting robots and craft and potential uses of automation for architecture restoration. And the joke that I make is that I ended up in Detroit because it's where the robots are, right, as a continuation of my practice. And Detroit is really one of the areas in the United States with the highest concentration of robots. There's like a very present culture of automation. We all know it's driven by the automotive industry, but also there's a sense of a culture as it relates to some of these things, a culture of manufacturing, and I see that as part of the local heritage in Metro Detroit. This is a mural by Diego Rivera at the Detroit Institute of Arts that sort of like talks about this kind of narrative, the beauty of making, the beauty of manufacturing when it comes to assembly lines, when it comes to like sort of human labor coming together to the production of something, mass products. And just to start to sort of narrow down my interests, the things I do and the way I teach these kind of tools, is always useful to understand where these tools come from. They come from assembly lines, they come from the sort of heavy production. And everything was generated at the beginning with Unimate, the first industrial robot that was tasked to sort of like repeat motions. So through repetitive tasks over and over, sort of to be part of a bigger choreography of production line. But that's a key point to me, because I really want to understand, especially, and Virginia talked about the Industrial Revolution. I'm interested in the fourth Industrial Revolution, in which production tools are starting to be smarter, and also there's also a shift that is happening between manufacturing and design, right? Like, we're starting to acquire more and more tools from the manufacturing industry. And so, is there an opportunity here to make connections with craft? So I started mapping some trends, looking at, in particular, like where I started, with restoration. There is a need for skilled labor. There's a need of kind of trained, high levels craft people, right, to carry out some of the jobs on site, but they are getting more and more expensive. And at the same time, the cost of machinery, the cost of the software environment, the hardware environment are getting more accessible. And that's also the reason why we have these kind of tools at school, in schools, in research labs, and specifically at Lawrence Tech. We use robots that come from the automotive industry. So that's another way of like reiterating that connection and thinking about that robots that in the past, sort of like retired robots that come from assembly lines, that come from the automotive industry, have a second life in schools, and their functionality gets reactivated through a different lens. So how can we use these tools for design and really leverage automation, leverage advanced means of production in service of design, in service of architecture. And so I think that higher education plays a very important role in this ecosystem. I started teaching robotics at Lawrence Tech, and for us it's very important that every student from across disciplines in the college need to know how to speak machine. I need to know how to use a robot. I teach a required class, at the end of the the design path, whether we're talking about architecture, interior design, product design. All students need to understand sort of how we can interact with these kind of tools, and how we can customize their use, as robots are just, I call them generic machines. They have axes, they can move in space. How can we leverage that for custom tasks, sort of like to start diverging from that idea of production of identical copies? And especially these times, experimenting also with AI language models. How can we interrogate platforms, for instance, like ChatGPT, to generate code that we can run using the robots to understand really the kinematic, to understand the position of these tools in space, and kind of read it through long exposure photos, painting with light. How do we understand the sort of mutual relationship between the human operator and the robotic arm that I often refer to as a disembodied tool, sort of like this tool that sort of augments humans when it comes to any kind of custom task that we can think of. And this is also a reference to the iconic images that were made by the Gilbreth and used to understand the practice of production. And Virginia talked a lot about like the use of the body, the presence of the body in spaces of craft, in spaces of making. And so just be able to read actually with more clarity these things, and through long exposure photography to understand the location of the body in a space of making, for me was also an inspiration to sort of establish and to craft these assignments for my students. And then ultimately part of that, of course, is model making. So how do you make space or ideas of space or proto-architectural ideas, so to speak, using robots that also allow you to work inside the materials, like in this case, using the hot wire cutter to create double voids inside foam cubes. All of this, if you're interested, I sort of collected some thoughts in this paper. as part of the Cumulus conference, in which I really talk about like the meaning of translating, like translation between coding and programming, and then the production of artifacts. Because ultimately, when you use robots, you're not really designing the final outcome, you're designing the kinematic, the motion in space to obtain that specific outcome. So I think that there's a lot of inspiration that comes from that. And so just sort of to give you an example of some, I picked one of the projects that I developed recently. It's called robotic mark making, and really looks at this idea of translating a practice of making that is well known, let's say like painting, right? Like, what does it mean for a human to paint, to produce a drawing, connected to our own skills and abilities and the dexterities of our hand gestures? How can we translate that using a tool of automation, using a robot, using a robotic arm? And so a starting point, using lines that I think are a interesting base construct, just in terms of like a base element of geometry that can that is open and then that can create connections with other entities. Just as a starting point, I thought was a good element to initiate this narrative. So the idea was to generate drawings that possibly were unique pieces, and I'll explain some of these things now, using a sketchbook, just as an intimate way of kind of showing this kind of work, like this kind of repetitive work on generating drawings using a robot, and how can we sort of articulate this sequence of operations with these methodologies, with this methodology. And so the idea that comes with that is to sort of use the robot to translate three-dimensional line work into, let's say, a 2.5D outcome that gets translated into a flat piece of paper, right? Like ultimately having on the XY plane the translation that comes from a much larger idea. And in this way, really by compressing this three-dimensional line work, was able to use a bounding box a few millimeters in height. And so in this way, the robot could navigate that space using a soft brush, meaning that when a digital line goes under the level of the sheet of paper, the soft brush starts pushing against the paper. And then this is the moment in which you have those unexpected sort of results. And again, I find more connections, Virginia, with the things you talked about. You talked about minor adjustments. So thinking about how you set up the robot, how you set up the tool, and how you change those the certain settings to obtain over and over different results. So you can change the speed of the robot, there's changes happen when you change the soft brush. So the ink level also plays a role in that, the texture of the paper, the temperature of the environment. All these things together start to really create results that then are, well, first of all, are difficult to simulate precisely digitally. That I think is the compelling part. And then they can create unpredictable results ultimately. So really looking into these geometries that also starting always from the idea of line works translated into like mimicking different sort of phenomena that come from the natural world, say magnetic fields, flow lines that sort of simulate the flow of water on topographies. So using these as inspiration and really producing drawings that by changing and by making slight subtle adjustments, you can produce different results. So this idea of like diverging from the reproduction of identical copies, really using automation to make results that every single time they are unique, and they're sort of like are the intersection of all those factors that I mentioned briefly before. And then when you zoom in into those drawings, you can really see and understand the subtleties. You can start to maybe see the directionality of the soft brush, maybe you don't, you know, it really depends on where you zoom in. There are moments in which you have patches of ink that come from like intensities or like different densities of line works. And so I think that in this kind of space, there's I say that there's space of debate really when we find these subtleties in the workflows. And something recently that I try to experience also is the use of different materials like biopolymers that really allow you to work in the 2.5D space. And so using the drawings and rearticulating the toolpath used to generate them to create a new materiality. So really using the toolpath to create the medium, then to express all those factors that come when we draw, for instance, we paint with robot, and always in that space that is in between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional space. More of this, just in terms of like a more extensive articulation of some of the things I talked about. This work was exhibited in different venues. One that I thought was compelling is an exhibition made in the metaverse, only because there was an opportunity to show the three-dimensionality of the line work that you don't necessarily capture all the time through the 2D drawings. And also this work was presented through a series of workshops, and ultimately with an exhibition at the Ford House in Detroit that was centered on the topic of, you know, crafting the digital age. And yeah, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Yes, we can do a little clap. That's yeah. So now we open up for conversation. So also all the participants can join, show your face if you like to, or ask a question if you have one. I'm really impressed by both of your presentations. I really liked. I don't know. There's this kind of. You both actually use the word intimate in the work you're describing, especially in the relation with the technology or the machine. You know, it goes from very soft, maybe even handwork, towards this. I think Sarah said something like, we have to. You need to speak the machine. And this also relates to what Virginia was saying about this is a very embodied practice. I have to build a relationship with it. And for me, that gives, I don't know, such a close relationship with the craft that comes and goes from there. This is not even really a question. I was just impressed by seeing how you deal with that and how you work with that, both of you. So maybe then the question, because you both also teach, maybe then the question is, how do you transport or share this with your students? Is that because I can imagine there's also like a frustration, especially in the beginning, if you start to learn it doesn't work. And then this intimacy is, I don't know, far gone.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it's like, it is something that you really have to build a lot of patience to work with. And I think with a lot of crafts, you develop the skill over time, right? And I think like the definition of crafts and craft making is kind of rooted in that, like the creator knowing the skill, and these traditions of apprenticeship where you learn the skill under somebody else. And I think that it takes a lot of patience and time right? You imagine like a woodworker, maybe as one of the traditional crafts, and like that maybe the first chair they make is not very nice, but they hone that skill over time. And so I always work with my students in this kind of patient way of working through production and reproduction and making over and over, and each time getting better. I think all the time my students are frustrated when they have to redo things, and I'm like, it's easier the second time around, right? Every time you do it, it gets easier and easier. You get better and better at it. And so I think working, and same thing with me, like my first piece I showed, like I knit and there's like strings hanging everywhere. It was a complete disaster. I couldn't have presented that, but I had to work with the machine. I had to develop that sensitivity to what the machine wanted, and that is something that relationship that you build as you're working is really important. And I think that goes for whether you're working with a knitting machine, with knitting needles, or with a robot, right? Like you have to be patient and be understanding, have empathy towards the machine to some extent. Maybe not empathy is like really the right word, but still understanding what does it want and how can I provide it what it needs.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. I really like also the way you talked about the intimacy, like your like personal connection with those kind of tools. I think I was interested in exploring that idea just in terms of what designers use, I guess, in their everyday practice, right? Like just to capture ideas. I've always had a sketchbook, right? And just thinking about notes, keywords, but also kind of like initiation of ideas. I think that was an interesting way of thinking about, okay, I want to make drawings, and I didn't say that, but there's also part of that was I've spent a lot of time setting up the workspaces for the students, because usually when it's great we get those robots donated, but they're all messed up. They come from like long lives in the assembly lines, and I need to understand, quickly how to fix them and how to create workspaces where we can do projects that are low cost and high impact. So that's how the idea of the drawings came to life in the first place. But really thinking about, okay, there's a tool of automation, it's very detached from us. How can we find a point of contact, right? Like, so I thought that the sketchbook was such a simple way of saying that's the robot sketchbook. So let's see the iteration, let's see what happens. And I don't know if you notice in one of the slides, but every time I make a drawing, I always annotate the tool settings, a few things, the robot speed, just to have a sense of like the uniqueness of that specific drawing or that specific outcome. And totally agree about the patience part, because there are so many points of connections between digital design and then the translation into the making. Hiccups can happen along the way all the time. But something that I really focused on is, how can you since you asked the question about how do we convey this through our teaching, I think it's important for me to tell the students that what they're making is unique because of all the conditions that come together. So the fact that you can adjust the tool, the robot tool, and when I say adjust, I talk about the scale of 1/10 of a millimeter, and you saw the sequence with the different drawings. So whatever you make is extremely unique, and you have authorship in the production phase, in the process. Even if you think that a robot is such a precise tool, it can replicate things, but yes and no, because like you have authorship in all those small adjustments that can happen along the way. And I feel that that's a good way to make students feel very connected to the objects that they produce, their outcomes that they produce, because the way I think we frame the narrative, thinking about what you make is unique. Like, even if I run your same code, and I could potentially have different results here through all these incremental adjustments that can happen along the way.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice answers. I don't know if there are already questions from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand or say something.
Hi, Ishita here.
Yes.
Sorry, my camera won't work.
Mhm.
I'm out of
You
on
have a nice
site.
profile picture, so we can still see you.
Thank you. I think I'm just putting this out there for us to discuss more. But the choice of colors was something that really stayed with me across the two presentations, and I think also because of the bias that craft is usually seen through color, and color is a very strong form of aesthetics. So I was just wondering if both of you or either of you wanted to tell us more about what you think. What role does color play?
Yeah, I guess I'll start because like my pieces were super colorful and they always are, but I personally always feel like I'm so bad with color. I literally wear only like black and white and like sometimes a little bit of pink um because I don't know how to match colors, and I think that I mentioned I kind of got the yarn like secondhand through a random guy. Um, and so I just had all these colors and I just like was like maybe a kid in a candy shop. I'm like, let's try this one. How about this one? Now this one. And so like the colors were maybe a little bit wild, but at the same point, I do agree that that is part of the process and part of the making. If I made those same pieces all in like white and black, you wouldn't maybe have that same effect of the kind of playfulness. You wouldn't be able to see the variation in the different pieces and parts, and it wouldn't maybe pick up that quality, that you can see the multiple layers because you see one color combining with the other, as they kind of play with that transparency. And I think that particularly like when you go to make anything, color is like a super important decision. But then at the same point, it's for me like I'm not doing tons of color theory to play into that, but it's more about just being playful.
That's such an interesting question. I'm still thinking about it. Um, I guess and I agree there oftentimes, especially when in my classes and when we work with robots, I tell students to stay very, very simple with the representation, to keep things very minimal, because there are many things you need to learn along the way, from the digital design standpoint, and then when it comes to really using the tools. But when I, like in my research, I've noticed that I tend to use accents. Sorry, I'm reading the comment. um, Accent color. So usually I use, and you've seen in the ink work, in the drawings, very, very simple black and white. But then when I've used the drawing typology of the magnetic fields in Grasshopper parametrically, usually you have a grid as a starting point and then you generate the magnetic forces. And in some of the drawings I've done black ink work, and then the grid of points was like bright pink or like a bright orange. So I tend to do this because I think the accents are useful to sort of to capture the attention or one specific detail of one specific part of the process. And and I'm still experimenting with biopolymers. I'm developing some material right now, but I tend to use translation from one color to another, especially when I have overlaps with the line work, just to see what happens. Like when you intersect biopolymer toolpath extrusion in one direction and in another, like at the intersection point, what happens? And I think that that's super interesting to see, to have all just this world merging and to observe the outcomes in that sense.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Somebody else with a question from the audience? If not, I have also other questions.
Can I
But
ask
oh yeah, for you.
can I ask a meta question?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, great. Thank you both so much, the presenters, for the presentation and to especially the specific world of making and craft. I want to ask about your reflections about how this processes of making, engagement with crafts and digital media, among others, is speaking to a specificity of a kind of feminist spatial practices, to go back to our theme, and especially the social agenda of working towards intersectional gender equality. Thanks.
Yeah, I think for me at least, like I kind of mentioned in some of that history of the knitting machines and that relationship, that knitting was originally like very, factory driven and male driven, and then there was this shift as we moved away from the factory and brought knitting into like more of a homemaker craft, and then it becomes more feminine. And we definitely see the kind of relationship of knitting and feminism, even in things like I always think of like the pussy hat as like this kind of way that a craft was used as a way for feminists like activism and things like that. And there's a reason why knitting was used for that, or crochet, because it was kind of already a tradition, but also what it meant and what it stood for in the community. So I think that uh, it's really important to acknowledge those relationships in my work. And also, like when I'm teaching, I think going back to like Renska's like thoughts on teaching, is like sometimes I'm trying to teach a bunch of male students how to knit, and I'm there with yarn, and I'm like, how does that yarn feel? And they're just like, a little overwhelmed. But to, to that end, like I have a class full of male students that are weeks in, and they love knitting, and they're like making stuff and having the greatest time. And so being able to break down some of those stereotypes of like that, that's for girls and that's for boys, and that we're actually able to create this playing field that's a little more even, where we can bring these traditions that are maybe perceived culturally in one way into something that everybody can do.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's also a very complex question, and I think like we can contribute for part of it, just to try to bring a positive impact. But I would start saying that I really pay a lot of attention, especially when I try to involve students in these research projects. The use of robots, the world of automation is always being, kind of established and carried out and crafted by men, right? So it's like, I think that women in this context have a lateral view that can bring a different perspective, a new way of even seeing the aesthetics of like the potential outcomes that can be created using robots, for instance. And I think it's very important to cultivate that. I was just thinking that recently I've been using text-to-image AI a lot, and I was reading the statistics, right? That 80% of the prompts are generated by men for some reason. And this is, like that kind of input feeds the outcomes, feeds the statics, feeds like that specific point of view. So like having a little bit of impact, being a teacher, doing research, I really try to be very careful when I hire students or where I hire my TAs, to make sure that as many points of view are included as possible. I think that that's incredibly fundamental. And I also think that things are changing in academia. There's a more attentive environment when it comes to that, where it comes to like hiring certain professionals in certain areas. Like I'm in charge of the technology sequence in the college, and I'm very grateful that I can really think through the curriculum myself. But there's, I think, things are slightly different when it comes to practice. And so I think that we play, Virginia and I, and all of us involved in this, like we really play a crucial role in like kind of, I don't want to say educating, but like really help women emerge and knowing that they can have important roles, especially when it comes to in architecture, the practice, but also the building sites little by little will become more intellectual places, and I think that the just in that context, women can have a more important role, and I think that we are part of that, just in the sequence that goes between like education and practice.
Yeah,
Sorry, it was a
really,
little bit confusing my response, but I was thinking while I was talking. Complicated topic.
it makes a lot of sense to me. And I hear, and as I mentioned already before, and I'm even thinking more clearly right now, that we are often taught like the fear of technology, and like the machine is disembodied, and there's a separation between what we do and the machine. But have I had, like in my education, more people presenting the relation with the machine as you did today, and the relation from craft with the machine? I think we never had come with the idea that the machine is a disembodied thing, because everything you talk about today is about intimacy, about relation, about it. It makes no sense to think about this huge separation. And I very much believe that what you have presented here today and what you do in your practice and with your students helps to make these relationships more clear and more close. And I'm really, I don't know, grateful of you presenting it in this way today, and helping us seeing that and articulate that even stronger towards, I don't know, next steps in this direction. I'm also thinking that this was more or less my last comment, because we have reached the end of the hour, unless there's someone with a really burning question that can be answered in a few minutes, but I don't think it is. So next month, on the 23rd, 5th, I'm sorry, I'm not clear, on Monday in March, we have a happy hour. And in this happy hour, we will open up the conversation once again about craft and elaborate more. So you have some time to think about it, to be inspired by what you heard today. And then you can come and join us on March 25th at noon ET, at the same time as it is today, to continue this conversation. And I thank everybody, both presenters and participants. I very much enjoyed the conversation today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, everyone.